My name is Carly Richmond. I Trisha and Helen were both pretty instrumental in me actually becoming a speaker in the first place. So before I spent 10 years working as a software engineer, I used to work for Morgan Stanley. And then actually through speaking to both of them and also starting to attend more conferences, starting to speak, starting to write, realized that actually I really enjoy content and kind of building small code projects rather than building and running enterprise level software. So I actually started in this group as a speaker, trying to learn, making a whole host of different mistakes along the way, trying to find out how to apply for CFPs, really trying to learn and how to kind of figure out how speaking actually fit in with my career. And what I ended up with was actually making a move into becoming an advocate. So I moved to Elastic, started off as a senior developer advocate, effectively making a huge change about 2 years ago. And this was off the back of starting speaking in the Inspire Speakers group in 2020, because it's a great time to start learning how to do conference speaking is through a pandemic when you can't go to conferences and you're talking to a camera all the time. But I decided to come back from maternity leave. I'm going to start speaking, and I'm going to start speaking through the pandemic anyway. So from there, I've been fortunate enough to speak at various conferences all over the world, including things like DevOps UK, which I definitely recommend. It's a fab conference to kind of grow up in as a speaker. I've got to write content for all sorts of different places. I've been on podcasts, and as of May this year, got promoted to principal advocate, and then about a couple of weeks after that became a manager of the advocate team as well. So it's been a wild ride. It's been a lot of fun, and I'm happy to discuss any nitty-gritty details on that. No such thing as a silly question. So happy to talk about CFPs, transitioning into advocacy, all sorts of different topics. Feel free.
Thank you, Carly. So let's go for Ellen for a quick introduction. Ellen, how are you today?
Hello, I am very well, thank you. And thank you for inviting me as well, because this group is very near and dear to my heart. And much like Carly, was instrumental in my speaking journey. My background is a little bit mixed, a little bit of Java development, a lot of technical writing, and then in 2020, as Carly has already referenced, everything is time-stamped by the pandemic. I joined JetBrains as a developer advocate alongside Trisha, and part of that job was public speaking, which I had done a little bit of internally, but I'd never got on a stage, and it wasn't the time to get on a stage because pandemic. So like Carly, I learned to do public speaking through this thing for many months through this group, and started speaking at local Java user groups through the webcam, and also when we were allowed to do it in person. And then got on the conference circuit. Fun story. If anybody has a question out there that is, once I've done a lightning talk, how many more lightning talks do I need to do before I do a conference talk? I can tell you the answer that Trisha G will give you. And the answer is none. You've done a lightning talk, you're ready, because that is exactly what happened to me. And I really wanted her to say, like, I don't know, 5, 10. She didn't say that. So I then went on to start speaking on the conference circuit. Stayed as a developer advocate at JetBrains. I did have a brief fling with MongoDB, but I came back to JetBrains. And yeah, I've done speaking in the Java community. I'm scratching an itch in the Python community. Actually, right now, hot off the press, I'm scratching an itch in data science, which is quite fun and exciting in a fun, geeky data sort of way. But yes, and I delivered my first keynote at Manchester Java user group unconference a couple of weeks ago, which was super exciting and fun for me, and actually has made me want to scratch the itch and get back on the conference circuit next year after I said I wouldn't. So that's me, that's my journey. Again, like Carly, happy to talk about any of it, all of it, none of it. Yeah, looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ellen. So Trisha, the youngest and least experienced member of this group, how are you today?
I'm good. Yeah, I mean, my experience is actually not that dissimilar from Carly and Helen. It's just it started a bit further back. So back in about 2011. So I was quite involved in the London Java community from end of 2008 to up until about 2013 when I moved here to Spain. And I had a lot of opinions and a lot of thoughts on how things should be done. So Barry kind of wrote me into getting more involved in organizing things and being more active in the community. And Martine and Ben, who were big active members then, they said, you should give a lightning talk at the LJC. And I was like, well, I mean, I suppose I could. And they said, it's going to be really good for your career. So I did it. And then I thought, well, I'll do a few lightning talks, and then maybe I'll do a full-length conference talk at the LJC, and then maybe do like a local conference or whatever. But after my first lightning talk, then my boss's boss, the CTO, was giving a presentation at Java One in San Francisco. And I managed to get a ticket for Java One as well. So he said, why don't you co-present with me? It's a topic that you understand, that because you've been blogging about it. And so you can co-present with me in this talk that I've already prepped. So everything's already there. You just have to be on stage with me while we talk about it. And that was obviously terrifying. I had an eye twitch for like a week about the whole thing. And, I couldn't sleep because it was just really nerve-wracking. But it was a really good experience. And it was such a positive experience that I just decided to move into doing more of that kind of thing. That was in 2011. So then I just ended up doing, and Java One is a great one to start at because it opens up a lot of doors to other conferences. So the following year, I just did a whole bunch of conferences, as much as I could do to sort of start speaking. And then I ended up moving to MongoDB as a developer advocate, and then 2 years later to JetBrains as a developer advocate. And I'm now at Gradle doing developer advocacy. So yeah, I've got, I don't know, what year is it? Well, like 13 years experience doing conferences and public speaking and that kind of thing. So I wouldn't say I've seen it all, not by any means, but there'll be, if you ask me a question, I'd be very surprised if I haven't heard that question before or haven't seen a circumstance which is applicable to answering that question.
All right, so just to get things warm, I will ask one question, and then please, everyone else shouting is your day. It's time for you to ask questions. So I think that my main question, and I always start with this, is I'm sure that before getting to public speaking at, I don't know, Morgan Stanley, LMAX, JetBrains, whatever you're doing, you did like internal conferences, right? How different it is to basically speak to a larger crowd versus like speaking for your team or giving like a to internal conference in your company. And any of you can take this.
I have a bunch of stuff
I'm
to
going
say, but I can go last. I'll wait for the others.
Trish has a lot of opinions. I would say the similarities are in terms of the nerves. I actually get just as nervous with a small audience as I do with a big audience. The bonus of a big audience, if it's cinema or DevOps Belgium, if any of you've been, you can't see anybody anyway because the lights are so bright. So it's brilliant. You're just talking into the void. The audio visual setup might be different. Generally at bigger conferences, you have a screen you can have your notes on, and you have a mic, which sometimes, if you're like me and you get clicky saliva when you're nervous and you speak, that can be off-putting. So you have to try a few things to sort that out. If you're not mic'd up when it's a smaller group, that can be a little bit easier. I think, yeah, nerves, I would say, are similar. Prep time, I would say, is similar, because ultimately it's your reputation on the line. So whether you're giving it internally to a smaller group of people or to a large group of developers, most of which you haven't met, it's still your reputation. So you still put just as much effort and time into it, I would say. Yeah, Carly, what do you think?
Yeah, I would agree a lot on the setup. The fact that you don't have, sometimes not having a microphone makes it less real and just feel like you're talking to a room randomly. But still, things like the amount of prep time, the potential, whether you're going to have slides or a demo, all those things are, for me, were exactly the same. Because when I worked at Morgan Stanley, it wasn't just that I did like occasionally talks to like groups. I was presenting demos. So sometimes the format is different because you might be sharing a screen and talking to people over a phone, which was a big thing. This was before webcams were cool. I think the other thing that might be slightly different and might be very specific to my experience as well is that depending on the organization, if you're speaking externally, you might need approval for your content before you go out. Obviously, if you're doing presentations inside, you don't have those levels of restrictions. You might also be able to dive into some nitty-gritty details around architectures and things like that that you might not be able to speak about externally for proprietary reasons. But aside from that, pretty much everything Helen said on the logistics definitely stands for the internal stuff.
I 100% agree. Like an internal conference is a conference. A conference is a conference is a conference. The audience will vary from conference to conference, but the things you need to worry about in terms of prep and slides and demos are the same. So if you have experience giving talks at internal conferences, then you're absolutely ready to give talks at conferences. It's exactly the same skill set. So given that, I want to pivot slightly and talk about, someone asked me the other day, did I have experience of public speaking before I spoke at conferences? So I gave my normal spiel of, I gave a lightning talk and I kind of got onto the circuit fairly quickly. And then this person very astutely said, yeah, but before you gave the lightning talk, had you been doing other public speaking type activities? And I was like, oh, it's true. I did do demos internally to stakeholders. I was a web developer, so I did a bunch of front end stuff. It was often my job to talk to internal customers, to prototype things, to talk to the business. And that's kind of presentation skills. It's certainly live demo skills, and things always go wrong. So I did a bunch of that when I worked at Ford and as an early graduate. I also was taught how to give conference talks because I was a graduate at Ford, and they put you on this training plan, and they gave me experience, like teaching me how to do public speaking. And then as part of becoming an official graduate at Ford, you have to give a presentation in front of an audience. So I was quite young when I did that. And before that, actually, weirdly enough, I'd forgotten about this. So I used to be, a long time ago, an active member of the Catholic Church, and I used to do the readings at church. So, and I was like 13, 14, and I was facing a congregation of people I didn't know. And granted, you're reading, so it's not the same as a conference, but you get used to that idea of people staring at you, listening to you. And I think having had that experience in my sort of formative years helps take the edge off all the nerves and all the different skills that you need to put together to become a conference speaker.
If I can just interrupt and add something to that. I don't do a lot of public speaking, but I've been involved in loads of social groups and running clubs and things like that. So I've always been used to standing in front of those people and introducing something. And so that's helped me get rid of any, well, not any, but getting rid of most of the nerves. So yeah, sorry. Hope it's okay, just interrupting and agreeing with you.
I'd like to add a counter as well, actually, in terms of the presenting internally versus presenting conferences. My most difficult audiences was always presenting at the lunchtime brown bags when I worked at LMAX, because the team there were much more critical than any conference audience will ever be. Like, it's constructive, but they already know what you're talking about. They can tell you when you said something incorrect or absolute rubbish. And their job is to try and, I used to give my conference talks to them before I gave it at the conference. Their job is to try and give me feedback to improve the conference. So the most difficult talks I ever gave was in front of a friendly audience. So if you've had experience of that kind of thing and found it not as positive as you would like it, because the friendly audience knows at least as much as you, then be aware that in a conference audience, they're like way better. They just turn up for the 15 minutes and they want to listen to something which isn't too boring and then get on with the rest of the day.
Thanks, everyone. All amazing answers. So I would like to open the room for questions. Alex, help me here. So like,
I've got 6 questions lined up if you want. Hopefully I ask one and then some other people will take over. So my first question is for everybody, really. Although I've been here for a long time and I've done loads of lightning talks, I think my last actual conference talk was over 7 or 8 years ago. But every so often I do get asked, can I appear on a podcast? Can I do a talk for a conference, and I've never heard of them, and I don't really know for sure what they're about. So my question is, how do you decide to turn down a talking opportunity, e.g. for an event you haven't heard of? Do you just decide, well, it's good practice, I should do it anyway, or what?
I have strong opinions on this. If you don't mind, ladies, I'm going to jump in.
Are you
When
sure? Trisha has
when-
strong opinions.
it depends on your goals, obviously, as a professional and personal goals. So there is no one right answer to this. So right at the beginning in 2011, 2012, and I was single, I didn't have kids, and I wanted to be a public speaker. I said yes to everything. It didn't matter if it's small, it didn't matter if it was large. The only constraint was financial. So if they paid for flights and accommodation, and if I could get the time off work, whether I took vacation or work let me go, I would go. So if your goal is practice, like you said, then you say yes to everything. I mean, there's some caveats to that. There were places I didn't go because I was worried about my personal safety, especially as a sole woman traveling on my own. So there's certain places where I'm like, I'm not going to do that without a good confidence network around me. So in those circumstances, you just say yes to everything, and it doesn't matter, provided you can find the time and the money. Now, I still find it really difficult to say no to stuff. So this is why I really wanted to answer this question, because it's very, very hard. So I don't need to build my profile anymore in the Java world. If there are other worlds, maybe I might want to build my profile in the .NET world, in which case I might say yes to something over there, because it's surprising how little overlap there is between the different technical communities. So at the moment, I'm trying to do some stuff around developer productivity. I can easily get myself into a Java conference because people know who I am, but developer productivity in the DevOps world is much more difficult for me because I just don't have any exposure in that world. So I might say yes to things which are going to help me in that direction, but I'm not going to say yes to, I did a whole bunch of NoSQL conferences when I worked at MongoDB, and I decided not to do any more of that kind of thing because it's not a sweet spot for me. It's not my Java audience. I don't really care about getting well known in the NoSQL big data world. So it was just much easier for me to say no. So you have to think about, like, what are your goals? What are you trying to achieve with this? And then on top of that, you have other things like I try and have, I set a limit of like 4 to 6 conferences a year, knowing it will probably go to 8 to 10. And so like at least 1 a quarter, and then things will creep in which are kind of interesting, and you end up saying yes to things. So when you set a limit, your default should be no, and they have to sell you on going to the conference. And then if they're trying to sell you on going to the conference, then I want to know, what is the audience? What's the technical audience? What's the size of the audience? What am I going to get out of reaching that audience? Is my work going to get something out of it and Gradle will pay for it and it's all good? Or am I going to be able to sell more copies of my book, in which case it's worth an investment, that kind of thing. So I really need to, and how much of a time investment is it, especially now I've got kids, it's much more difficult. And are they going to be paying for travel and accommodation? And on top of that, now I'm based in the south of Spain, getting places is very difficult. So the first thing I do is find out, can I get there straight away? Do I have to connect? And how long will it take? To get to San Francisco takes me 28 freaking hours. It's just insane. And I will say no unless there's a very good reason. But surprisingly, also places like Oslo, anywhere in Northern Europe is very difficult for me to get to. It takes minimum 12 hours. And you're really going to have to sell me on that.
Thanks very much.
I would add to that and say, don't just know your goal, write your goal down and work back from your goal. If your goal is to be known in the data science community, maybe you have a Nexus event that is to speak at PyCon US. Okay, when is PyCon US? All right, it's next May. So, all right, I've got 7 to 8 months. Which CFPs are going to be open? Which ones am I going to submit to? And be selective. Like Trish says, work out look at your criteria and be selective in terms of location, be selective of do they pay travel and accommodation, be selective of which speakers have they had in the past. This is something we should all be mindful of. If you can look at the past events and actually let's be blunt, all the speakers are male. Do you want to speak there? It's things like that you can think about and you can look at and then say, well, which local user groups can I speak at before I get to that point? How can I get feedback on this talk? What kind of talk do I want to create? And then, work it all back from your next event and then put the CFP in, but don't, or my advice would be don't submit to everything unless your goal is to be well known and you have, you know, to your point, Trisha, you were single, you lived in London, you know, you had the means at that time to do it. Yeah, just be mindful of your goals. And then I wouldn't like to be in a situation of turning down a conference because I've submitted to too many CFPs. So I tend to be a bit more selective nowadays, even if I do just want to get my name out there. Because I wouldn't want to say I can't go there because I already said yes to this.
When I went to MongoDB, they suggested like you don't submit CFP unless you are going to go.
Exactly.
Like, I mean, it depends a little bit more. At Gradle, there's a bit more of kind of, you know, submit to 2 or 3, but I will generally not submit to 2 conferences at the same time because it's a commitment to me.
Yeah, same. I've seen a lot of people are like, oh, it's okay to submit to like multiple conferences or in case one falls through, but I don't do that either. I just feel like, well, I'm assuming I'm going. I think that's good advice. I think the other thing which some people have said to me sometimes is they actually check if conferences have a code of conduct, in addition to everything that Helen and Trisha have said, because if there's a code of conduct showing how the community is going to be treated, how to escalate and things, it normally shows as well that it's a conference that takes the consideration of the community as being very important and the safety and well-being of everyone. So that's another thing that I've started checking for recently is, do they have a code of conduct? That's normally a good indication if it's reasonably well organized at least.
It's very interesting.
Sorry, and there's one more flag but that I always say no to if a conference does this. They email me, I don't know them and I don't know their conference, and they say, you're a woman speaker, come and speak at our conference. I'm like, no, thank you.
You're a male conference organizer, go bother someone else. Alex has another 6 questions, but do we have any other questions from anybody else? No, in that case, Alex, question number 2 of 6.
Give them a few more seconds. Anybody want to feel free to shout out? And I think some of my questions have already been answered. So thanks very much straight away for. I do have another question. Hopefully, it'll lead to some more questions. One of the things that I'm not sure about, so I'm thinking about a talk or a presentation, and I'm wondering whether to do it as like a one-off. So I'm writing a talk just for this conference and I'm never going to do it again, or whether it's something that I want to be talking about often and want to reuse that talk. So how often do you think you repeat the same talk but for a different audience with minor tweaks? Is that making sense? Do you like do a unique talk every time or what?
I'm going to let the others answer because I have a firm answer to this.
Carly, do you want to go?
I can start because actually, initially when I got into speaking, I thought I had to have a brand new talk for every single conference and I could only give it once. And if you're going to go down that route, then you're going to realize that your time fills up with preparation very quickly. What I tend to do is I have over time built several talks and I will recycle them and keep submitting them in places where it makes sense to submit them. But it also means if I want to take a slight spin on it or do something different, or take a talk, create a new talk that's based on elements of existing ones, I recycle some parts of it. It's not just about having that one talk and that's it. Sometimes you can spin it. So a good example for me when I've been doing a lot of observability stuff since I started at Elastic is I started diving into things like real user monitoring and synthetic. So I have separate talks for each of those. But then sometimes if I want to give just an overview of general front-end observability, I can take elements of each of those talks and combine them into a new one. So I recycle not just full talks, but I also recycle parts of them and join them together into something slightly different. And because I'm an advocate that works with other advocates as well, quite often we'll share elements of content as well. So if someone has a diagram for something like vector search and it's actually very useful and people have found it's went down well, we will recycle each other's pieces, but also try and make it our own in our talk. So there's a few different ways that I recycle. I guess, Helen, Trish, what do you tend to do?
Same. The keynote that I delivered recently, a third of that was a compressed version of a talk that I delivered at DevOps Belgium last year. I think what I would say, you touched on it there, is submit to conferences where it makes sense to do so. So if you're going to be creating a talk, Alex, have a think about what conferences are coming up, CFPs are coming up that you think it might make sense, and think about the audience. Because if you create a talk that is going to, your audience is going to identify with across a broad range of conferences, then brilliant. I think you could only come a little unstuck if you create a talk that's for a very niche audience, and then that becomes a little bit harder to recycle. But everything that Carly just said, I completely agree with. Trish?
Yeah, I'm going to be more prescriptive. Absolutely designed for reuse. Do not give one-off talks. It's a huge waste of time. You should be putting 20 hours of prep into a conference standard talk. So the last thing you want to do is put 20 hours of prep into a 1-hour talk, which you never give again. Now, reuse can take lots of different forms. Like you said, like I had not been good at what Carly was talking about, where you can reuse bits of content and rebuild talks. And it's partly because I wanted to talk about a lot of different things, and partly because I tended to talk about versions of Java. So you're always looking at the new thing. But over the last couple of years, I've been using more bits and pieces of different talks, and it makes life so much easier. Creating a talk from scratch is creating a talk from building blocks. So that's helpful. But the other thing I used to do a lot at JetBrains is reuse the content for blogs, for tweets, for YouTube videos. So I'm doing these YouTube videos for Dave Farley's continuous delivery channel right now. And a lot of that content is bits and pieces from my conference talks. Because the last thing I want to be doing is researching, I don't know, Jupyter notebooks in Python for a continuous delivery talk, when I've just been talking about testing best practices in Java. But if you've got a 50-minute presentation on testing best practices in Java, you've got probably, I don't know, it's not 5 10-minute videos, but you've got 3 10-minute videos out of that content. You've got a couple of blog posts. You've got, if it's a live demo, you've got a bunch of tip tweets that you can give, and animated GIFs. And I used to do this all the time at JetBrains. Otherwise, you're never going to have time to do anything else. So yeah, absolutely aim for reuse. It doesn't have to be about giving the same talk at multiple places, but my personal experience about giving talks is I don't know what the talk is about until I've given it 3 times minimum. So if you've given it 2 or 3 times, you're not getting the most out of that talk. After 3 times, you really want to take it out, dust it off, have a bit of a think about, okay, what is it I'm really saying? You don't even need to change it, but the topics you talk about, how you talk about it will change over those 3 talks. So you need to give it 3 talks before you know what you're talking about. You might want to retire it after 3 talks, because you might be like, oh, I really hate this talk. Or you might want to rework it or pivot it or just polish it. And I quite often, after giving it twice, mostly what I do is just delete stuff. Like, that's not relevant. I don't need that. I can spend longer talking about this thing. So yeah, I would give it minimum 3 times. I tend to have a talk per year, which is like my talk that I'm going to give that year. I mean, because I've been doing it for long enough. Like Carly, I've got a whole bunch, and Helen, got a whole bunch of other talks I can roll out. If people want a IntelliJ idea talk, I've got 3 I can give, But then that talk that I've got for the year, I'm expecting to give that talk 3 to 6 times minimum, I think.
You touched on something there that we haven't really said, is that talks do get better each time you give them. Generally speaking, you're both, the first time you give a talk, which is really,
you're gonna hate it.
The keynote,
you're just gonna hate it.
It gets better each time. So like, that worked, that joke didn't work, the audience identified with that didn't land, and you iterate on it. So that's a really strong point for use case.
And the first time you give it as well, I found when I gave my testing talk at DevOps Belgium, and I've been doing this for a long time, I spent so long working on that. I was so deep in it, and I was so nervous about it, and I still get nervous, that when I gave the talk, and it's DevOps Belgium where you can't see the audience. So I gave the talk and I hated it because I hated the way I felt about it, but I didn't have enough feedback, and I was too deep in the woods to have any way of iterating over it and improving it. I needed to give it again a second time when I was a bit further away from the content, when I could watch the audience and figure out what they were reacting to.
Thanks. So we have some questions in the chat to answer. I have a question of my own if there is time at the end as well. But Lena, well, she asked about conferences, like reusing materials which has already been answered. But she also, I think that's a really good view for you, Ellen. Like, how do you create like supporting material for talks, articles, blogs, giving your expertise here?
I think I got the tip I'm about to mention from Trisha, let truth be known. But when I'm creating a talk, I create either a page on my website with all the links that I've used, or for the keynote, I did a gist on GitHub just with a QR code. So at the end of the talk, because I am a speaker that goes fast, and I own it, and it is what it is, but I am a fast speaker, and my style is 90 odd slides for a 50-minute conference presentation. I know you're all going, oh, but that's just what I do. I'm rapid. That's my style. Other people aren't, and that's great. So I always say at the start of a talk, I'm going to be going quickly. I will be mentioning resources. They will be at the end. You don't need to take notes. Just sit back, relax, and enjoy the ride. So that's more about my brand and who I am. But when I'm putting the talk together, I create a QR code or something with all of the resources. In terms of supporting materials, I could probably do a better job in this area, if I'm completely honest with myself. I tend to like hyper focus in on giving the talk, and then I kind of get back from the talk and we're like, yay, I did the talk, and then you get the crash after you've done the talk. And then it's sometimes quite difficult to go, I should create some content about that. So should you? Yes. Am I good at it? No. Trisha?
Yes, I do create a single blog page. It's a static page, not a blog post, for all of my talks. And there's three main reasons for this. All the stuff that you said is great too, like, because people want the slides. They always want the slides or the video. So that's where you put the slides and the video. I do a lot of research when I'm doing my talk, so I read a lot, and I just dump all the links on there, because then that means I can go quickly. I can be like, I read this article which did this thing. I'm just going to pull out the thing which is interesting to me. But if you want to know what the article is, go over here. I don't have to explain everything in depth. So I can just put all of that stuff, all the demo code, all the documentation I read, getting this feature working. I just put it all there. So I don't need to explain that in the talk. So that really helps me to slim down the talk. So that putting that research there allows you to go faster, go shallow. It's also a portfolio for you, especially as a new speaker. So you want to be able to say, if you're submitting to DevOps Belgium, the CFP closed last week, so you can't. But if you're submitting a talk to DevOps Belgium, you can say, I've already given this talk in 3 different places. Here's the resources page. It's got slides and videos on there. So you can use it. So again, sometimes that can work against you, because some conferences do prefer unique-ish content, or at least content that's not been recorded before or isn't worn out. But you can use it to at least, you can show a conference a whole bunch of these pages to say, I've given 5 talks on this kind of topic, so you can trust that I know what I'm talking about. So it's really helpful for your portfolio. And the third thing is, I just have a really terrible memory. So when I come back to this talk and I need to re-give it in 3 months' time, I look at the page and go, oh yeah, there's all the research. Let me reread that thing again. And this is where my slides are. And so I know I have one place where a lot of that information is.
Yeah,
Listen, go ahead, Carly.
I was going to say I would echo that. I normally, actually, probably learning from Trish and from Helen, I always try and do at least a blog post on my personal blog. Sometimes if it's Elastic specific stuff, there's appropriate forums that are Elastic related. So it's more about, for the post, figuring out where it should live. But I always write a blog post with every talk if I can. I always have the code examples available in GitHub somewhere in a separate repository that I can share with people, because some people, if they can't make it or they want to look things up afterwards, they always want the code snippets. And I also try and make sure that they're up to date. It's really easy to forget to update those extra peripheral things and just focus on the slides. But making sure that those are up to date as well is very important, because it's effectively an artifact for your talk. So just make sure you keep them up to date as well.
So this is, I'll do the same thing as Alex did here. I'll do a follow-up on this one. I'm curious, because all of you have like famous talks or sometimes also inherited famous talks from other speakers. I don't know. I've seen you folks doing IntelliJ tips and tricks from Hadi and Hariri. And you're also employed by customers that expect certain subjects. So I saw, I don't know, Carly jumps into LangChain with Elastic, and then she comes here and talk about developer relationship with us, and then jumps somewhere else. And I seen all of you do it like 4 or 5 different subjects all the time in those conferences. Do you keep all of your portfolio up to date, including all of the stuff? How do you manage to maintain all of that would be my question.
Let me share a link. The others can talk.
We're waiting for your link, Trisha.
Oh my God, I can't find it now. I can't remember what it is hidden.
So the question is, how do you keep all your portfolio up to date with your talks, past and present?
Especially when you're doing different things on completely
And you've
different
got different
universes.
threads.
Like
I think that's probably going to be quite an individual answer. Oh, there you go, trishag.com. So, yeah, I mean, putting it on your website is definitely one. I think I'm gonna do a Trisha G classic and say it depends. I think it really does depend. Like some people might prefer to each day at a time and use the socials. Some people might prefer to be a little bit more kind of have one place, have a static one place like Trisha does, and then use the socials. Some people might drum up noise more on the day because, you know, when you go to a conference, we all have these great plans and we all make our lists of we're going to go there and we're going to go there and then at that time we're going to go there. But also, as anybody who's ever been to a conference knows, you get curveballs and then you're like, oh, actually my colleague's going to go to that one, so I'm going to skip that one and I'm going to go to that one instead. And a lot of people they'll walk up to the screens outside the rooms and they will make a snap decision right then and there about which talk they're going to. Maybe they've seen something on X, not Twitter.
No, on
that
social
day.
media.
On social media, exactly. So I really think that one depends. In terms of keeping it up to date, whatever you choose, I would just say just schedule it, set aside some time in your workday to do that.
I mean, I would say you're just not going to. Like
Yeah, well,
my public
that's also
appearances
me.
page, I updated it recently and I realized there's like 2 years worth of stuff missing. And a lot of it is like, I'm sure I did a thing. You were asking questions about podcasts and stuff. And so I put all my podcasts in there, my interviews, my written articles, where I've guest blogged somewhere else. And if you don't keep that up to date as you go, you're going to forget. So sometimes I just have to Google myself and find out what pops up. And I put it there to remind myself. I started it so that I could show it as a portfolio as a beginner speaker to say I've done all this stuff. And now I use it so I can actually have one place where I have all of that stuff in case I'm like, sure, I did a podcast on this thing once, and I'm sure I spoke about something. And so you can kind of drag it up from that. And it's also useful for going, oh yeah, I've got some friendlies who would interview me on various things. Let's find out who they were and when was the last time I spoke to these people. So but the thing is, like, we, all of us should do way smarter things around. Like, I would love to have my website to have, like, you know, like products do, a landing page for Trisha G Java Championing, and a landing page for Trisha G Developer Productivity, and a landing page for Trisha G Buy My Book, you know. But I don't have any of that stuff. I just have ad hoc blog posts and pages and social media and whatever.
I think that there is one interesting side of Alex's question, which is how do you start getting like basically invites to do this podcast and less structured kind of content, or how did it start for you? How can we get there?
Podcasts, I get invited onto podcasts. I think that as a woman speaker, I think we actually have more opportunities there because people are always trying to find more women to appear on podcasts and be interviewed and be on panels and stuff. So I think this is one area where it's an advantage to be a woman. When Helen and I wrote our book together, I realized I really wanted to do more podcasts and more promotion for the book. And I realized I've never done anything in that area. I just do opportunistic stuff. If people come and ask me stuff, then I'll do it. But that's why I needed to look back over my list of podcasts to go, can I go back on this podcast and tell them about my new book? And that's kind of what I want to do. There are resources for doing that. I'm not good at that.
Any takers from you, Helen or Carly?
I think in terms of how to get invited onto podcasts, it's a lot about noise in a good way. You know, you've done the conference circuit that generates internet. It generates noise. It puts your name out there, and a lot of the podcast hosts who are interested in a specific subject, that's where they go and look. You know, who's speaking at that conference? Where do they work? Then they basically, from what I can tell, and I'm not a podcast host, but from what I can tell, it's got a lot to do about stalking. In a good way. You know, they look you up. They find out what you've been doing, and if they like what they see and they like the kind of content that you're creating, they're more likely to send you a LinkedIn message or a message on social media to say, would you like to appear on my podcast? That's how it's happened for me anyway. It's been they've seen noise, and they've looked at my profile, they've looked at my website, they've looked at the content I've created, and then they've invited me onto the podcast.
Yeah, pretty much the same. I mean, I did see something the other week where someone in like internal within Elastic was like, oh, there's this podcast, we might need someone to help with it, but that is very rare. It's always been someone reaching out off the back of socials, or even that I've met at conferences and things. In terms of tips for preparing for them, ask if they've got a particular set of questions in advance. Not that you want to over prepare, because then for a podcast it kind of loses its authenticity a bit, but just having an idea of roughly what they want to cover as a topic. If there's critical questions they want, ask for those so that you can kind of prepare, particularly if you need to look up particular things, if you're representing your company, for example. And just be yourself, have a bit of a natter. Make sure that your setup is fine, that you know you're in a quiet room where you're not going to be super interrupted. Consider whether they're going to have, you know, is it a podcast in terms of it's just sound or is it video? Because they do a podcast on YouTube, for example. Just be aware of maybe the considerations you need for your setup as well. But they're a lot of fun actually, because it's more of a natural conversation rather than a formal conference talk. It's more of a back and forth. So if you get the opportunity, definitely recommend it.
I would agree with all of that. I would yes and you. Having an idea of what the questions are is helpful because you can have a bit of a think about what you're going to say, or topics, as you say. The thing that's most helpful for me as a podcast guest is if I don't do that or I forget to do that, I need to think about the number one thing I want to get across on this podcast. And there may be like 2 or 3 sub things, but like the number one thing will probably be buy my book or talk about developer productivity at Gradle. And so I'm going to have in my head, like at some point, if they start talking about developer productivity, I need to talk about how build scans help developers troubleshoot builds. Like, and it sounds a bit artificial, but the way that I can square this in my mind is like you say, Carly, it's more informal, it's more conversational. So then you just talk about stuff that you care about in that. You don't give the company line. You just like, or even with the sell the book, buy your book. Like, you know, we write the book because I've got so much stuff in my head and I really wanted to share it with you. And like, I really think that's helpful. And it means that I don't have to write all these things on Twitter all the time. And you've got it all in a book, you know. So you just have to think about what's interesting to you about that particular topic. And here's a top tip. And you should watch news interviews for this because politicians do this all the time. Like, you don't have to answer the question. You don't have to be on topic at all. Like someone says, I mean, it doesn't take much of a slide. Someone says something like, oh, I get asked about AI all the time and I don't really have enough. I haven't used generative AI very much. So they ask me things like, what do you see the impact of generative AI on software development teams? I get asked this a lot. And I'm like, I don't really know because I haven't worked on a software development team for 10 years. I've been a developer advocate for 10 years. I don't know what modern teams look like and I don't know how they're using AI. However, I do know what AI generated code looks like, and I do know how the software world works. So my answer is going to be something like, well, you need tests for that stuff, you know? And then I can steer it into, I have a talk about unit testing and how you can generate tests effectively and why testing practices are terrible. And then you get to talk about the things you want to talk about. You don't have to talk about generative AI at all.
I'll do the same, yes, and because that is basically answer the beginning of Alex's next question, which is how much of a total expert you have to be to give a subject. But I think that there is another angle to it, which is like how you prevent yourself from being extra nervous and what kind of ruining it. like Carly, I think you are especially impressive. I see you jump from relationship management to, I don't know, front end to LangChains with Elastic. And maybe you are a subject area expert on all of this, but like I would like feel very, very uncomfortable. So how do you convince yourself that you're good enough for this talk and get what your employee wants and what you need to do?
So I have a very relevant and recent example, which Helen knows about because we talked about this before. I gave a talk at DevOps UK in May about machine learning, picking up something that I'd never done before. And to be perfectly honest, it was a good talk, but it had a last minute pivot because up until probably about 3 weeks before, I'd had a whole host of extra stuff going on, and I didn't have working code until really close to the edge. And it was the first time I'd felt really underprepared and because I don't always feel like an expert, but what I do leverage is my experience. What the experience felt like is very relevant and helps tell a story that's a bit more unique. So the things that have helped me is I don't always talk about things that I'm an expert in, but I am comfortable saying I don't know because I have to, because I can't know everything. Because one of the things that I guess might be quite specific to Elastic as well is that I have to cover numerous different ecosystems when I talk about topics because there's search, there's observability, and there's security. I can't know everything. I just leverage my experience of being an engineer that had to flip-flop between a load of different technologies, pick up things where I go. So I probably don't go super deep in everything. I'm probably more of an M-shaped developer because I go diving deep into some stuff, but I'm really superficial in others. And I just embrace that. And I'll mention when stuff doesn't work and when things go wrong, like the time I had the CORS errors that I couldn't figure out with TensorFlow, or when I wrote a model that was so bad that it thought everything was cake. Just lean into the failures and things that don't work because you can add that into the talk and make for a more convincing and authentic story, is what I would say. So in short, I'm not an expert in a lot of the stuff I talk about. I just use my experience and my thoughts to make it seem relatable and help people learn, really. But I'm sure Helen and Trish have got ideas on this too.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I have to dash off, so I just want to. I'm going to talk about this bit, and then I'm going to run off before the end of the meeting. I'm so sorry, it's very rude. Yes, you don't have to be an expert. Yes, you do need to be comfortable and confident. And that's the thing. In order to not be nervous in a talk, you have to have this core confidence of the things you're talking about, which can sometimes be. I've seen mine and Helen's friend Maz give a really good talk on stuff that went wrong when she was trying to start with DevOps, stuff that she didn't know, stuff that was difficult. It was a fantastic talk. So she basically was very, very honest about like, all this stuff. I don't know how to command line this, and I don't know how to do that, and these tools are terrible, and your documentation is shit, and I just don't really know. It was really hard for me to get going, and it's difficult to do that kind of talk because you stand up and you just say, I basically don't know what I'm talking about. But developers and other technical audiences, they love it because either they know that stuff and they feel really smart. They're like, oh, I knew this stuff. Or they don't know that stuff and they're like, oh my God, I'm not the only one. I thought it was just me. So whenever you do beginner level, entry level, or I struggled with this thing type talks, you've always got the whole audience on your side. There will always be that guy who goes, I already know that stuff and you're really dumb. But that's like one guy. 95% of the audience is just like, oh my God, I'm so happy to hear your stories. I feel so much better about myself now. I have to go. Bye.
Thanks, Trisha. It was amazing having you. So I'll just again, I'm at this point I'm reading Alex's questions. If anybody else have questions, please shout out. Like we're all welcoming to do it. But Alex asked about like adding like interactive like pieces like polls and things like that to your talk, and that is something that I feel as well, like especially in the tech in like the tech industry, sometimes like nobody says a word during your entire talk, and then at the end everyone tells you that it was great. But like, how do you like engage the audience? How do you play with them and basically call them to participate?
So I think, firstly, I think audience participation is very important. I'm almost sort of verging on critical. But audience participation can come in a variety of ways, right? It can come in purely engaging with the audience through eye contact, which is quite hard if you've got big bright lights in your face. It can come in the form of asking the audience questions. So I do this one a lot, especially with smaller talks where I can see the audience, you know, how many of you have experienced this, or, you know, so on and so forth. So getting the engagement that way. And if you're going to do that, be aware that the poll could go, it could go both ways. It could go the way you want it to go. It could also go the way that you're not expecting, and the way that, so I had this in the Manchester keynote, you know, I asked a question, has anybody felt or got really frustrated with the project and felt like, oh, and of all the people in the room who put their hands up, 3 ladies put their hands up, and every single guy in the room kept their hands down. And I said, well, the ladies are a lot more honest than the rest of you, because I was like, this is ridiculous. You're all developers. You've all got frustrated at some point. So I had a way to spin it, and I had to think on my feet. But it was one of those times where I expected every single hand in the room to go up, and it didn't. That didn't happen. So I would say engagement comes in many different forms. And you just be aware that you might not get the engagement you want. You might get a deafening silence back, as an example. And in that case, you need to be prepared for that and be okay with it, because it's cultural as well. Like I can remember giving a talk in Oslo, and I thought I can't remember what the joke was now, but I thought it was really funny. I think it was about Log4j, and I thought it was very amusing. Silence. The joke just died in the room. It just died, and I can remember having this split second of going, okay, that didn't land, moving swiftly on. But I did the same joke at DevOps UK, and it got a laugh. So it can be cultural as well, in terms of you need to think about that. Think about, again, it goes back to your audience. Think about who your audience are, what your audience are looking to get out of your talk, what cultural differences there might be, what you need to take into consideration there.
Yeah.
Thanks, Helen. Carly, do you have anything to add there?
I think I would add, there's the option of the technical side of using tools. So there's things like Mentimeter, Slido, etc., which you can use for polling. And quite often that's a good way to maybe naturally extend a shorter talk when you're starting to figure out how to extend it. So if you're on your speaker journey and you're looking how to extend a lightning talk, adding in a poll can be a useful way of helping you figure out either avenues to take it further to extend it, or also just giving you a few extra minutes. But you need to make sure that the tech is there. So you need to make sure that it's working, test it before the talk. I've had situations where the polling tech doesn't work for particular reasons, or check to make sure you've got things like a stable internet connection for tools like that. For that reason, a lot of the time I'll do what Helen's talking about, where I might ask people to raise their hand or ask particular questions, because it also makes it fun and engaging for me. But before, when I started, I just wanted to talk and then run off the stage as quickly as possible. So, you know, that's probably the situation where you're not feeling comfortable enough to use a poll or some other form of engaging with an audience. And if that's your comfort level, it's okay to just give the talk and even run over so that you don't have Q&A. If that's your comfort level at that point, that's fine. But it is fun once you're getting to be more accomplished and comfortable speaker. Asking questions either as a raise of hands or asking people to shout out, or even using polling can make it fun and more interesting, as long as you have the negative and positive scenarios covered of what you're going to say.
You're totally right though, Carly, about when I first started speaking, I wanted to do the same. Get on, talk, get off. I didn't do enough audience engagement. It's only more recently that I've got a lot more comfortable with that, because providing you've got both routes covered, or if you haven't, you know, you can think on your feet and get to the place you want to get to. It's a lot of fun, and the audience love it too, because you're talking to them. You're not just talking at them. You're asking their opinion.
Thank you. That was amazing. That is actually something that we can implement here, even here on the aspiring speaker sometime. So speaking of raising hands, we have time for one last question. Does anybody feel like asking anything?
If you don't want to come off mute, you can drop it in the chat as well.
All right. Otherwise, so like I again really from the bottom of my heart wants to thank like all of you, like Carly, Ellen, and Trisha that already left for doing this. It was a fantastic session. Like I learned quite a bit, and it's great. I think like I love the Aspiring Speakers group exactly because of that. Like we don't get the opportunity to have this kind of conversation every day, right? So I would like to thanks Recworks and Barry Cranford for keep the practical side of things and everything else happening. And I hope that we'll have many, many, many other opportunities to receive all of you here again, and maybe raise the next generations of Carlys and Ellens and Trishas to like that will be denying conference calls in San Francisco and everything else because like uh it's fantastic to see how like great things start small, you know, like and how accomplished all of you how far you got in very little time. Okay, Trisha is being modest as well overall, but like it's amazing to see like basically how the community has affected so many different people. You know, we have speakers that had their first DevVox UK experience last year, and they ended now giving conferences all over the world. I'm always very happy with the results. And that is it. Thank you very, very, very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks all, Annie.
Take care.